there was a tendency to assume that the people who were poaching were extremely poor, they were starving, they were poaching in order to survive, and that the game laws were extremely cruel, and the Black Act was frequently cited, and people were being given incredibly harsh punishments. Now, although I'm in no doubt that the game laws were class legislation, they obviously were, and that a lot of poachers were very poor, that is an overstatement. Two historians called the Hammonds, who were husband and wife, who wrote The Village Labourer in the early 20th century, their verdict on the poaching situation was that the blood of the poor was spilt for the sport of the rich. Well, the essence of that is true, but it's exaggerated. If you actually look at the punishments that most poachers are actually getting for poaching when they come up in court, they are practically always getting fines that are far lower than those that the magistrates could impose. Much, much lower. And often, even for night poaching, they are frequently getting, again, imprisonments that are much lower than they could be given. And historians have speculated as to why this is the case. And of course, one of the reasons could be that some of the magistrates were genuinely benevolent country gentlemen, who of course were in no doubt that they were superior to the people that were appearing before them, but still did see their role as paternalist. And they knew these people were poor, and so they didn't want to give them the harshest sentences they could. They also, surprisingly often, would find them not guilty when they were appearing before them at a petty sessions where there was no jury. It was just up to the magistrate or the magistrates to find them guilty or not. They surprisingly often did just dismiss the case and found them not guilty. So it could be that they were genuinely paternalist and benevolent and worried about the poor. It could also be, and undoubtedly was the cause sometimes, that they were worried about what would happen if they were too harsh. They were aware, particularly in the first half of the 19th century, towards the second half of the 19th century, there seems to be a consensus that crime and the poor were very much under control, and England was a relatively stable place. But earlier in the 19th century, this wasn't the case, and they could be a bit worried. They're still thinking about echoes from the French Revolution. They're still worried about popular uprising. They don't want to annoy the plebs too much. They're aware that if they're too harsh, they may cause bad feeling against them. They're also aware that even very small fines, very often fines of just a shilling, cannot be paid by the poacher, and so he, therefore, in default, he is going to be imprisoned, because if they couldn't pay their fines, they were put into prison for anything from a week to 2 months. And if they were in prison, then their wife and family were going to need to be supported on the parish, or supported without relief, or put in workhouse after the new poor law, and they were going to have to be supported on the rates. And so that were other reasons why they often seem not to have imposed as harsh a sentence as they could do. So before I go on to what I've got down next, does anybody want to ask anything?
Did the number of people prosecuted increase during times of economic recession?
Reading historians who are writing about poaching, some of them will declare absolutely as fact, like Munch, for example, Gentlemen and Poachers. This is a really good book by P.B. Munch, but he is not on the side of the plebs at all. And he declares categorically, poaching was not motivated by hunger. If you look at the statistics for prosecutions, you will find that they do not correlate with times of difficulty. Whereas other historians, like D.J.V. Jones, for example, and Archer, will declare there is a clear correlation between poaching and times of difficulty. So the secondary evidence is completely conflicting. My personal opinion would be that obviously when times are worse, people are going to poach more.
Was there any distinction made between people who are clearly poaching because I need to feed my family and those who might be poaching and then selling on the quiet?
Only if you were appearing before a summary court, that is, you're appearing just before magistrates, only if the magistrate decided to make that difference. There wasn't anything in the statutes that made a difference. But yeah, I do suspect that the benevolent magistrates often did make a difference about that. I mean, there's some instances in some of the parliamentary papers of people being given fines that are as low as threepence. You know, when the fine that the magistrate could levy for that was up to £2. And I certainly do suspect, from secondary evidence, from what other historians have said, that yes, quite often I think magistrates, if they knew the family and they knew there was a problem, they would give them as low a fine as possible. Sometimes they would even just give them a warning and dismiss them, I think. But then I think you saw the opposite as well. I think you saw some really vindictive magistrates who would always do the worst that they can. In the 19th century, the vast majority of poachers, both before 1831 and afterwards, were summarily convicted. And by that I mean they were convicted in a court that didn't have a jury. And it may not have been anything that we think of as a court. It could just have been a gentleman's room in his house. And sometimes the JPs would have what they called a justice room. Now, I think this was well on the way out by the 19th century, actually, because some of the primary material that I've worked from in the game returns does show the number of JPs that people have been convicted in front of. And increasingly they were being convicted in front of more than one, even when the law didn't lay down that they had to. So I think, and again from secondary information, I think they were often using a room in a pub or something that they used for a petty session, and 2 or 3 magistrates would meet there. But legally, even after 1831, if it was day poaching, there only had to be one magistrate. He could fine you up to £2, which was an awful lot of money in the 1840s, and I don't think it changed greatly, actually. I don't think inflation was much of an issue or changes in wages. A framework knitter who was well employed might be making about 8 or 9 shillings a week. If things were going badly and he was getting very little, he might be getting as little as 4 or 5 shillings a week. So if you consider, a fine of £2 was an enormous amount to them. If they could pay it, and quite often they could, and I shall argue that has to be a sign that they were involved in poaching on quite a large scale, or they wouldn't have had that much money. Secondary sources suggest that often poachers were so rigged into the black market that the people that they were selling to would lend them money to pay their fines. And so just as the gentry had prosecution associations and had game associations so that they could share the cost of catching and prosecuting poachers, and some game associations employed gamekeepers as well. So, according to some historians, poachers were in groups as well, where they sometimes even were organised enough to have people that were the treasurer, that kept the funds to pay people's fines. Now, I've not found any evidence of that, but, that is what really sort of kosher historians are saying. So the vast majority of poachers appeared summarily just before a magistrate, and they could get up to a fine for £2 for day trespass. They could get a fine of up to £5 for poaching without a certificate. This would be after 1831. I think that they must have got them for poaching without a certificate when they were on common land, because you could be got for trespass if you were on enclosed land, but if you were on common land but you still haven't got a certificate, they had to get you for that. And I suspect that if you were a quite lower class person, but you had managed to find the money to buy yourself a game certificate, and you were poaching on common land, I suspect you were probably okay. I think if you were on common land and you'd taken a pheasant or something, it probably still could be claimed that that was Lord So-and-so's pheasant, and so you might still be done. If you couldn't pay your fine, you could be sent to prison for up to 2 months. Now, surprisingly, night poaching as well could be prosecuted summarily. But the Night Poaching Act of 1828 lays down that for night poaching, you have to be prosecuted before at least 2 magistrates. But if you were convicted of night poaching, you didn't have the option of a fine. You were going to get put in prison. And for the first offence, it was 3 months in prison. For the second offence of night poaching, it was 6 months in prison. And for the third offence of night poaching, it could be transportation of up to 7 years. For subsequent offences, it could be transportation for longer. Quite a handful of poachers were transported, or were sentenced to transportation. In 1831, the death sentence, as applied to poaching of game, was repealed. And so, after 1831, you could no longer be given a death sentence for poaching. In fact, even before then, I think people virtually never were given a death sentence for ordinary poaching. They were given these death sentences for the sort of disturbances that occurred in the 1700s when they were bothering about the Waltham Blacks, who were the deer poachers near London and in Southampton, who were dressing up, they were disguised, and they were terrorising the whole neighbourhood. They were really bothering the gentry. Certain people got hanged for that. But nobody got hanged for poaching in the 19th century. Very occasionally, poachers got a death sentence, but that would be because there'd been an affray and they'd killed a gamekeeper. And if they could be convicted as guilty of murder, then they would get a death sentence for that. On the rare occasions that it occurred that I've come across, it's always been rescinded, and they've always ended up being transported. So quite a few poachers did get transported, and I think this happened, I'm talking about this area now, and I'm talking about my evidence from my research. And I think this happened when they'd been violent, when there'd been an affray, and when they were known to have a history of previous convictions for poaching. Of those that got sentenced to transportation, even before transportation stopped as a sentence in 1856, I think it was, quite a lot of them actually never got sent. I mean, they stopped sending people to America a long time ago because America had become independent and obviously wasn't going to take our criminals any longer. But they were sending them to Australia. And I know that stopped officially in 1856, but I think it stopped in actuality a long time before that, because I've come across in the National Archives certificates being given. This meant they were released on a certificate that they must never offend again. It just so happens that I came across these. They were in 1851, and they were people being released, and they'd been in the hulks, in the prison ships. They'd been in hulks for anything up to 5 years, and so they'd been sentenced to transportation in the late 1840s, when we would have thought they'd still be being sent, but they'd never gone. And they'd been sentenced to 7 or 14 years transportation, and they just rotted in a hulk for several years, and then they'd been given a certificate and released. But on the other hand, sometimes they did go, and I have managed to track at least one person. I try not to get sidetracked onto tracking people, because you get a bit hooked on it, it takes for ages. But I have tracked one Hezekiah Birdsall, and partly I tracked him because he's got an unusual name, and that makes him easier to be tracked. From his poaching to his poaching conviction in the 1840s, to Australia, where he arrived, and a report on his condition when he got there. So some of them did get there. But night poachers generally got convicted by 2 or more magistrates at a petty sessions to 3 months or 6 months. That doesn't sound terribly long, but it's long enough for their families to become destitute. But written into the Night Poaching Act as part of the sentence was, it wasn't just a sentence of 3 months, it was a sentence of 3 months with sureties to be produced at the end of the 3 months. And for the first offence, which was 3 months, the sureties were 2 lots of £20. I don't know why it says 2 lots of £20. Again, I need some help from somebody who can help me understand these statutes. From the offender, and then more sureties from other people. So that, in order to get released at the end of his 3 months, a poacher was going to have to produce £40. And in order to get released at the end of his 6 months, a poacher was going to have to produce £80. Well, they're not going to be able to produce this, are they? Virtually never, I would have thought. And if they couldn't produce that, in default, for the first offence, having served 3 months, they had to then serve another 6 months. And for the second offence, having served 6 months, they then had to serve another year. So, in fact, these were much longer prison sentences than they appeared.